Christian McCaffrey, Isaiah Pacheco, Kenneth Walker, maybe Joe Mixon. These are just a few of the names that at the running back position we are swiftly being reminded why fantasy football is pain. So you know what we need to do. We need to break down every relevant player at the running back position in every matchup for week 3 and go over who you should be starting and who you should be sitting as we approach week 3. Before I do so, let me remind you guys that Underdog is the place you want to be if you want to get in on additional fantasy football action all year long. Week 3 pick'ems are already live, and if you want to claim a free pick'em for Thursday Night Football, Aaron Rodgers over half of a total yard, use promo code TheCatch. That link is down below. If you watch this video later in the week, don't worry, you will still get a free pick'em. Go ahead and claim your free new customer pick'em with promo code TheCatch, and while you do that, you're going to get a 50% deposit match up to $1,000 on Underdog. That's up to $1,000 that you can use towards your free pick'em combination on Underdog. Let's break down our starts, sits at running back. All right, first up, we have Thursday Night Football. We will have the Patriots traveling to face the Jets, and Ramondre Stevenson has 17 or more fantasy points in each game so far on the season. At the time I'm recording this, he's the RB8 in fantasy football. So Ramondre Stevenson, even on the road, let me remind you, this Jets defense might be a good defense, but they are not good against the run. So I don't have any fear of starting Ramondre Stevenson even on a short week. He still saw 21 touches on the ground in week 2 after having 25 touches in week 1 and 3 or more targets in each game so far on the season. So I think Ramondre Stevenson easily stays in the start category. Antonio Gibson, 7 touches week 1, a little ramped up to 11 in week 2 and 96 yards on the ground, 8.7 yards per catch, and added 1 target and 1 reception. So Gibson's still a sit for me. Maybe he's a player you're keeping an eye on who, if you're needy at the running back position, you might consider picking up off the waiver, but he's going to be a sit for me until we see a more stable, consistent stat line emerge there. Breece Hall, this offense for the Jets is looking interesting, but it does not matter. Breece Hall is still the focal point of this offense, and you are still starting him on a week in, week out basis. The next player we're going to talk about maybe has left you a little bit of concern for Breece Hall, and that's Braylon Allen, who had 19.6 fantasy points in week 2. But even with Braylon Hall emerging here, Breece Hall still had over 24 fantasy points in week 2 compared to Braylon Allen's 19.6 in week 2. So I'm not going to freak out for any reason about Breece Hall. He is staying in our starting lineups, but Braylon Allen should be one of the top, if not the top, waiver wire addition moving into week 3 after having 7 touches on the ground, 4 targets, 33 yards on the ground, 2 receptions for 23 total receiving yards, a rushing touchdown, and a receiving touchdown. So the interesting thing with Braylon Allen is you look at this Jets offense, you got Garrett Wilson, then you got Breece Hall, Xavier Gipson, Malachi Corley have done nothing. Alan Lazard had a good week 1 and then did nothing in week 2. Mike Williams has done nothing, and Tyler Conklin has not been productive at all. So it's literally going Garrett Wilson, Breece Hall, and now maybe Braylon Allen, and they're getting both running backs here, at least they did in week 2, both involved in the passing game. So Braylon Allen is a strong watch candidate for week 3. He should be picked up. He should be rostered. I don't know that I'm going to say you can flex him or start him just yet, but if we see another solid week in week 3, he's certainly going to be moved up to at least the start him if you need him category. We'll see what week 3 holds. Moving along to Sunday's action, we have the Giants traveling to face the Browns, and a little harsh here, but I got Devin Singletary as a sit. I know he was okay in week 1 and then scored a touchdown in week 2 and was pretty efficient on the ground in week 2, had 14.5 fantasy points, but I just don't think anyone out there is really going to have to go out of their way to start Devin Singletary. If you're in a deeper format, or if you own Isaiah Pacheco and Kenneth Walker, and those are your only running backs, like, uh, okay, sure, I guess the volume's there, but Devin Singletary also faced the Washington Commanders in week 2. So, and then in week 1, he was not efficient on the ground, but he added 4 receptions, which helped that stat line. So, I the Giants play the Commanders in week 2. I know there were better offensive performances all around, but I just can't feel good about Devin Singletary or any Giants running back going into week 3. And like the Browns haven't even been phenomenal defensively. They were very good last year, but I just don't feel good about this matchup whatsoever. So I'm going to leave Devin Singletary on the bench unless you are just out of this world desperate, which with after the first 2 weeks of the season, you might be, so that's okay. But looking at the Browns running backs, this was a weird game because Jerome Ford was looking really good in the first half, was on pace for a solid game, and then we saw like a lot less usage out of him in the second half and more usage to Donta Foreman. So I read that was due to the rain in the game against the Jaguars and Foreman being better in between the tackles, and I don't really know what happened there, but I still think Jerome Ford's a solid start. This Giants run defense has been bad through the first 2 weeks of the season. He's kind of close to tinkering with the only if you need to category, but I'm okay with Jerome Ford. It's still good volume in week 1. My argument through the first 2 weeks has been that all the volume should be there for Jerome Ford, which now is maybe stifled a bit by Donta Foreman, but I'm not going to overreact here. I think Ford is still the running back to own and start for the Browns, and I'm just not confident to start Donta Foreman or Pierre Strong. And Pierre Strong is now week to week with a hamstring injury, so he really should be downgraded ultimately overall, but I don't think you were thinking about starting him anyway. So Jerome Ford, I'm still okay with. Devin Singletary, only if you're desperate. Let's move along. All right, next up, we have the Eagles traveling to face the Saints. And at the time I'm recording this, Monday Night Football has not been played yet. I have to record these Monday mornings. So something major happens. Maybe we'll look at this Eagles running back room differently. But I think we're just going to be rolling with Saquon Barkley. Even if he doesn't have a great performance in week 2, you still have to start Saquon on a week-in, week-out basis. And the only reason we'd be considering another Philadelphia Eagles running back is if we see a major injury to Saquon Barkley. So Barkley, yeah, you are starting him. And until further notice, we are starting Alvin Kamara on a week-in, week-out basis. Don't care about the matchup. Unless Alvin Kamara is injured, he can no longer even be considered anywhere close to the bench. And we haven't been considering him anywhere close to the bench in the last 2 weeks. Going into week 1, he was my top running back, 4 running backs that will dominate week 1 going up against that Panthers run defense. And that kind of solidified him as a start in week 2. I was not anticipating 44 fantasy points or 4 touchdowns, don't get me wrong, but there's not a lot of discussion to be had here. Kamara will be in starting lineups until further notice. He is the RB1 in fantasy football at the time I'm recording this. And although Saquon, balled out in week 1, it's going to be tough for him. He's going to have a really strong performance as well to beat out Kamara as the RB1, but you might very well have the 2 best fantasy running backs in this matchup in fantasy football going into week 3. Jamal Williams remains a sit. He really only scored that touchdown in week 1 because of garbage time. So 8 touches in week 2, he's going to be nothing but a handcuff until further notice. So we are sitting Jamal Williams. So Barkley, Kamara, if you own them, you're feeling pretty good. Let's move along. Let's move along to the Texans traveling to face the Vikings in week 3. And Joe Mixon had that ankle injury in Sunday Night Football, left the game, was able to come back and play a bit, didn't have a good stat line, finished with 8 fantasy points. At the time of recording this, we don't have an update on Joe Mixon. He's going to go under an MRI, see how bad this ankle injury is. It was a hip drop tackle that he got hurt on. And a lot of those this season that have not been flagged, and certain players that are very valuable in fantasy who have gotten injured because of it. But, this is just one of those kind of wait and see what happens. If Joe Mixon plays, then we're still starting Joe Mixon. If he doesn't, then obviously we're not starting him. But I'm not going to be too scared off. If he is deemed good to go, we have to start him because that volume in week 1 we just can't ignore. The volume got hurt in week 2 because of the injury, but also because the game script was kind of wonky there, where the Texans continued to need to throw the football for almost the whole game. So I guess Cam Akers is the RB2 on this team because Dameon Pierce has been dealing with that hamstring injury and was inactive in week 2. So if you're looking for a handcuff, it's a little shaky right now, but I guess it's our boy Cam Akers, who had 7 touches, 32 yards on the ground and a reception. Also had a fumble that was lost in this game. So I don't want to start Cam Akers. I don't want to start Dameon Pierce just yet. I mean, if we see an extended amount of time for mix and missed, one of these two guys is going to be valuable. And right now, because he's healthy, it's probably Cam Akers, but the fumble was a little bit concerning. So 4.57 yards per carry was nice to see. Fumble was not nice to see. If you're looking for a handcuff or maybe potential week 3 play, I guess it's Cam Akers, but this Vikings run defense is not bad. They weren't really able to stop Jordan Mason, but they have not been bad overall so far on the season. They were not bad last year. So I don't know that I really want to roll out Cam Akers or Dameon Pierce in week 3. All right, Aaron Jones. I said this last week. I think Aaron Jones is going to be a start for me, like unless we see a really bad pattern emerge. You know, the ceiling was low in week 3, or excuse me, in week 2. But if he hadn't fumbled in this game, he would have hit double digits again. He finished at 9.8 fantasy points. So, you know, I think where you drafted Aaron Jones, he's probably your RB2. You're probably just going to roll with him like as a low-end RB2 on a week-in, week-out basis. And to me, that's all Aaron Jones is. So you can start him. The game script should be good here between the Texans and the Vikings, who've looked good offensively. But if he doesn't score a touchdown, you just got to expect a lower ceiling. Then Ty Chandler has been pretty involved through the first 2 weeks. 8 touches, 3 receptions in week 1, then 10 touches in week 2. So I do like Ty Chandler as like a handcuff who, if you're really desperate, you could plug in. But yeah, I'm not going to go out of my way to start Ty Chandler, but he's definitely a strong handcuff at the moment. So let's pay attention to Joe Mixon as the week progresses. Maybe by the time you're watching this, you already have an answer to what's going to happen with Mixon for the week. And let's just consider Aaron Jones a low-end RB2 as we approach week 3. Next up, we will have the Broncos traveling to face the Buccaneers. And I'm not touching these Broncos running backs. I just can't do it. I can't trust either in my starting lineup. I know Javonte Williams somehow against the Steelers had 11.5 fantasy points. He had 1.5 yards per carry, 11 rushing attempts for 17 rushing yards. So that is not good. He did add 5 receptions off of 5 targets, 48 receiving yards. That's really what saved that stat line. So I'm not going to trust Javonte anytime soon. The Jaleel McLaughlin, had the targets and receptions in week 1 and then had 0 in week 2 and 0.6 fantasy points. So I am just staying away from basically this whole Broncos offense until further notice. I don't want anything to do with them. Looking at Rachaad White, who had the groin injury in week 2's matchup against Detroit, there's certainly a reason for concern here. 10 touches, 18 yards, very bad on the ground. 1 reception for 5 receiving yards was definitely hampered by that groin injury. So we don't know for sure if he's going to play in week 3, but if he does, I'm still starting Rachaad White. He will be fine. Game script wasn't great against the Lions, although I would argue that a game script like this should help Rachaad White because he's a player that when the Lions need to throw when the Buccaneers need to throw the football, he should be getting involved. But I think the groin injury was in the way here in week 2. So if he's healthy, I'm still starting Rachaad White at home against the Broncos. Bucky Irving had 3.1 yards per carry against the Lions. This is a good run defense for the Lions, though. Had 7 touches in week 2. So Bucky Irving, I think, a strong handcuff to own right now. If Rachaad White does not play, I think if you were desperate, you could start Bucky Irving. But for now, we're going to go ahead and list Bucky Irving as a sit. And we're going to need to monitor these Tampa Bay Buccaneers running backs as the week progresses. Moving along, we got the Packers traveling to face the Titans, and even though we did not get Jordan Love playing in week 2, I still told you guys I thought that Josh Jacobs would be a solid start in week 2. Would have loved for him to find the end zone because he had 32 rushing attempts, for 151 total yards and 4.7 yards per carry with Malik Willis at quarterback. So, time of recording this, we don't know, is Jordan Love going to play in week 3? Excuse me. He's going to play in week 4. I don't know. I heard rumors he almost played in week 2. So, for me, it doesn't really matter. If Jordan Love is out, obviously they're going to rely more on the run game. If he plays, this offense overall is going to be more efficient. So, Josh Jacobs is just going to continue to be a solid week in, week out start. We saw Emmanuel Wilson get 5 touches in week 2. He had 1.8 yards per carry, 0.9 fantasy points. We saw Marshawn Lloyd actually play. He missed week 1. He had 2.5 yards per carry and a reception for 2.8 fantasy points. So we're not putting Emmanuel Wilson or Marshawn Lloyd in our starting lineups anytime soon. And it kind of complicates the handcuff situation there if Jacobs, does sustain an injury, which, cross our fingers, no more injuries this season. Please, fantasy gods. But moving along, let's take a look at the Titans. And I really liked Tony Pollard going into week 2. Once again, another player that would have been nice to see him find the end zone, but he still had 15.2 fantasy points, 62 yards on the ground, and 5 receptions. So I like Tony Pollard again going into week 3. I think he's a solid week in, week out start until further notice. And it should be noted that Tajay Spears, RB2 on the Titans, suffered an ankle injury in week 2. So he's expected to be fine and be able to play this coming week. But I still think that elevates the stock of Tony Pollard just a tad bit. He's already been playing very well with 15.2 or more fantasy points in each game so far on the season. So Tony Pollard, a strong start. Josh Jacobs, a strong start. I don't think there's any reason to start any other Packers or Titans running back moving into week 3. All right, moving along, we got the Bears traveling to face the Colts. And get on in here, all you DeAndre Swift haters and all you who warned me of DeAndre Swift this season. He looks bad. The Bears look bad. This offensive line looks bad. And a result of that is that rookie quarterback, Caleb Williams, is definitely struggling. And I don't think there's a single Bears running back we can feel confident in starting anytime soon. Khalil Herbert did have a touchdown. He only had 2 rushing attempts. He did have 2 receptions, 8.7 fantasy points. There's just no ceiling here. DeAndre Swift improved from week 1 to week 2. He had 8.2 fantasy points. In week 2, we did see some PPR upside, had 5 targets, 4 receptions, 24 receiving yards. But he had 18 rushing yards off of 14 rushing attempts. So the thesis might still be there that, the PPR upside is there for Swift, and he's the most talented running back here. But the overall thesis against me was that the Bears' offensive line is bad, and that we don't know we're going to get out of the Bears, and that they're not going to see the red zone a lot, and that there's other running backs here who can vulture touchdowns. So for now, I am staying far away from the Bears running backs unless you are very desperate and you're hoping for Swift or maybe Herbert, I guess, to stumble into the end zone or have 4 catches, and that's how you're going to get 8 fantasy points for the week. So Travis Homer, also involved here with 1 rushing attempt. He's not on the screen, but yeah, we're not starting any Bears running backs anytime soon. All right, moving along to the Colts. Jonathan Taylor, just a week in, week out basis. It was a little concerning. His usage in the 4th quarter was like super, super low. But this Colts offense is a bit confusing as a whole right now. But overall, he was very efficient in this game. He had 12 rushing attempts for 103 rushing yards, 8.58 yards per catch, 2 receptions. So 10 fantasy points in week 1, 15.5 in week 2. I think where you drafted JT, you just continue to start him on a week in, week out basis. This offense is a little shaky, but I'm not necessarily worried about them this week. Then I guess Trey Sermon is the next running back up here. You saw Tyler Goodson have 1 target and Trey Sermon have 1 target and 2 rushing attempts. So there's just nobody else on this roster that we even need to discuss. And JT still a solid start at home. I'm not going to panic about the Colts offense, although they're a little shaky in week 2. They should be fine. And yes, DeAndre Swift truthers, unite against me in the comments below. he's a sit moving into week 3. So we have the Chargers traveling to face the Steelers. So a little bit of a more stout run defense for the Chargers in week 3 compared to the Raiders and the Panthers in their first 2 games. J.K. Dobbins was an absolute must start for me going into week 2, a player I heavily encourage you guys to start once again, stating it would not be a fluke, and you can't ignore this Panthers run defense and how bad it is. Walked away with 20 fantasy points, has 20.1 or more fantasy points in each matchup so far this year, has had 131 or more rushing yards in each game this year. So tougher matchup here. Maybe the ceiling's not as high, but he's still a very strong start. It is worth noting, I mean, J.K. Dobbins, 10 touches, 3 receptions in week 1, 17 touches, 1 reception in week 2. Gus Bus still had 11 touches in week 1 and a target reception, and then 18 rushing attempts in week 2. He's still involved here, but he's just not nearly as efficient, not finding the end zone. Maybe Gus Bus starts to do some things that hurt J.K. Dobbins' value, but until we see it, I'm not worried about J.K. Dobbins. He's got to be a very strong start approaching the week. And Hassan Haskins had a little bit of involvement in this game, but he's not going to be a player that we're starting anytime soon. Moving along, let's take a look at Najee Harris and Jaylen Warren. And I mean, I think for the most part, this is probably how I'm going to feel about the Steelers backfield for the rest of the season. If you own Najee Harris, you can start him. Like, is the ceiling there? I don't really quite know or think so, but if you need to hunt for just points and a safe floor, it looks like he's still going to be the lead running back in this offense, and that Jaylen Warren is kind of the odd man out. But I think with this offense as a whole, you're just not going to see a super high ceiling because this offense is just, quite frankly, not scoring a lot of points. Now, Jaylen Warren was a little bit better in week 2 with 8.10 fantasy points, and you compare that to Najee Harris's 8.4, maybe this is a little bit unfair, but Najee had 17 touches in week 2 and 20 in week 1, where Jaylen Warren had 9 in week 2 and 2 in week 1. And they've both had 2 targets in every game this year. So I'm still going to lean towards Najee Harris, but once again, what is the real ceiling here when this offense is barely scoring any touchdowns? So this Chargers defense hasn't particularly looked bad to start the year. There's a Steelers defense, so I don't expect a ton of points in this game. But for me, in this matchup, J.K. Dobbins, still a good start. Najee Harris, if you have to. Let's move along. Let's take a look at the Dolphins traveling to face the Seahawks. And we're looking at the Dolphins running back room. This was my statement for going into week 2 Thursday Night Football. If Devon Achane plays, you start Devon Achane. If Devon Achane does not play in week 2, then just sit everyone else. I don't want any part of this Jalen Wright, Jeff Wilson, injured Raheem Mostert headache. Devon Achane's a good start. Everyone else right now is a question mark. And although Devon Achane appears to be fully healthy, ready to go for week 3, so there's less of a discussion, this is still exactly how I feel. We will start Devon Achane until further notice, as long as he's healthy, regardless of matchup, regardless of the quarterback situation. And everyone else, Jeff Wilson, Jalen Wright, Raheem Mostert, are just sits. And quite frankly, I don't know who the handcuff is here. So I don't even know if they're worth rostering at this point because it's just too much of a headache and too much of a gamble and might end up just clogging your roster. So Devon Achane remains a solid start. If you're worried about, Tua not playing, Achane's going to be fine. Maybe the ceiling's lower, but Achane will be fine. You still have to start him because even if the ceiling's lower, that ceiling is still high. All right, Kenneth Walker missed week 2 with that oblique injury. And in relief, Zach Charbonnet looked pretty dang good. I was a little wary of him on the road against the Patriots. He looked good in week 1, but he had a touchdown on the ground, 14 touches, and he added a nice 5 receptions off of 5 targets for 31 receiving yards. So Zach Charbonnet kind of elevated. Last week I was worried, I don't quite know what we're going to get out of him as an RB1 on the road against the Pats defense, and he showed up. So he gets elevated from a sit to the flex category. But the big question here is Kenneth Walker going to play in week 3? And at the moment, we don't know. So I'll say it this way. If Walker does play, I think you could still flex Zach Charbonnet because Seahawks are at home and this Dolphins defense has not looked good to start the year. So I think Charbonnet still has, flex category potential this week, even if Walker plays. And if Walker does not play, then that moves Zach Charbonnet up to a solid start in week 3 against the Dolphins. So I like the Seahawks running backs this week. We'll see what happens with Kenneth Walker and just stay away from the headache of the Dolphins backfield unless you own Devon Achane. All right, that'll bring us to the Panthers traveling to face the Raiders. And oh my, what are we going to do with this matchup? Let's start with the Panthers, who are going to have Andy Dalton at quarterback and not Bryce Young this week. So I think that will help potentially, hopefully. Can't be much worse. Chuba Hubbard was okay in week 2 at 11.6 fantasy points, 6.4 yards per carry, and 4 receptions. So I think in a 16-man league, for example, or if you've just been decimated at running back with all these injuries, you could start Chuba Hubbard. I feel slightly better because the quarterback changed. But for majority of you guys, Chuba Hubbard's a sit. Miles Sanders is a sit. This offense is in shambles. This team is in shambles. It's a mess, right? So I don't feel any confidence here. You'd have to be pretty desperate, but I will say with the right level of desperation, you could start Chuba Hubbard. But for the most part, Panthers sit moving into week 3. All right, this brings us to a tough evaluation here. I don't even know what to do with these Raiders running backs. And if it were practically any other team, I would have them both as sits. But this is the worst run defense in the entire NFL in the Carolina Panthers, and a team that has allowed a lot of fantasy points, an average of 20 plus fantasy points to RB1s to start the year. So I don't know what to say. Do I trust Zamir White, who had 2.6 yards per carry last week off of 9 touches, 3 receptions, 6.8 fantasy points? No, because he's not even getting the goal line work that's going to Alexander Mattison, who in week 1 had that receiving touchdown and 6 targets and then 0 targets in week 2 against the Ravens. So it's Madison had 4 rushing attempts and a rushing touchdown. This is a really tough evaluation. It's all over the place, but somebody is probably going to score. That's, you got a 50-50 shot here. Zamir White, Alexander Mattison. If you're desperate enough as the week progresses, strictly due to matchup, I think you could start White or Mattison, but only if you're desperate, because I still don't trust either of these guys. But like I said, it's the Panthers defense. One of them is probably going to score. I don't want you to have to find out by starting one of these 2 guys who that's going to be, but they're just a big old question mark for me. Let's move along. All right, that'll bring us to the Niners traveling to face the Rams. And man, oh man, oh man, Jordan Mason's season is upon us. And the way things are unfolding for Christian McCaffrey's health, I don't think it's going anywhere anytime soon. So Jordan Mason, who I did have a start last week, and most people did, is going to remain a start. I did mention throughout the week, you might have 3 or 4 stud running backs, or at least 2, and you might be in a spot where you're making a tough decision, and this Vikings run defense hasn't necessarily been bad, and that actually proved true for most of this game, and then they just could not hold Jordan Mason back. I mean, this Kyle Shanahan offensive system just allows for stud running backs, and that's not to take away from Jordan Mason at all, who's looked great to start the year. And I mean, this backfield is completely owned by Jordan Mason right now. I mean, you've seen a couple passes in each game to Kyle Juszczyk, but outside of that, Isaac Arando, Patrick Taylor, there's just nothing here. It is all Jordan Mason. 17.4 fantasy points in week 2, another touchdown, 100 yards on the ground. Mason is a must start until further notice, especially against a Rams defense that appears to be an absolute shambles. Jordan Mason is just absolutely killing it. I'm so confident in him this week that I will go ahead and head straight to Underdog and take the over on his total rushing yards. He is just absolutely crushing this Niners backfield, and this Rams defense has many reasons for concern. So I would go ahead and take that over. And don't forget, if you guys are new to Underdog, you can claim a free pick'em to pair with Jordan Mason's over on the rushing yards when you use promo code the catch. Go ahead and combine those two to triple your first entry. While you're at it, you're going to get a 50% deposit match up to $1,000 on Underdog. That's up to $1,000 in bonus cash on Underdog, plus that free pick'em when you use promo code the catch. Now, Kyren Williams, I still have as a start. Some of you guys might be looking at things like, all right, we got Stafford still. This offensive line is a mess, though, and now we don't have Kupp, and now we don't have Puka, and this Niners defense is pretty good. So you might be worried about Kyren Williams, but he was fine in week 2. 15 fantasy points, a touchdown, 12 rushing attempts, 5 targets, 4 receptions, 27 receiving yards. So I'm going to say that Kyren Williams at home remains a start as we approach the week. And I think his ceiling could be lower, but I'm not going to panic on Kyren Williams until we start to see it. So this should be a good test. Like, what are we going to get out of the Rams with whatever offense they're going to roll out there? But there are times last year where, Puka was missing or Kupp was missing, and this is still a good offensive system. So I'm going to trust Sean McVay and still start Kyren Williams. Worth noting that Blake Corum had 8 touches in week 2 compared to 0 in week 1. And then Ronnie Rivers had just 1 target, 1 reception, 0 touches in week 2. But either way, we're hunting for a handcuff if we own either of these two guys in fantasy. They're not getting anywhere near our starting lineups anytime soon. Moving along, we are going to see the Lions travel to face the Cardinals. And on a week-in, week-out basis, so far in the season, I've said you start Gibbs, you start Monty every single week, no matter what. And that is proving to be true, as they are both in the top 12 at the running back position thus far on the season. 17.6 fantasy points in week 2 for Gibbs after having 17.4 in week 1. 17 on the dot in week 2 for Monty after having 16.3 in week 1. They have combined for 3 total touchdowns on the season. They are going to continue to be the vocal point of this Lions offense. And Cardinals looked better in week 2 defensively, but I'm not ready to trust this Arizona Cardinals defense. So I will say Gibbs and Monty, regardless of if they're your RB2 or, if you own Monty or if you're throwing him in at the flex, they are both strong starts this week. You already knew Gibbs was, but for anyone who's, went into the season like lower on Monty, he is still heavily involved in this offense, and I don't think we're going to see that change in week 3. All right, James Conner, another player who maybe you drafted late, maybe some people were doubting, had 19.4 fantasy points. He now has 19.3 or more fantasy points in both games on the season. This is a tough matchup. The Lions' run defense has proven to be good to start the year, like they were last year. It's a home matchup. The way Connor's playing, I don't really care who he's facing. We're starting him. The volume's there. We saw this Cardinals, overall offense open up a bit more, to say the least, in week 2 against the Rams. And this Lions secondary is not good. So I think the passing attack's going to be there for the Cardinals at home. And we're definitely going to see a lot of involvement out of James Conner. So no question, he's another must start. Trey Benson, due to game script, had 11 touches in week 2, was not efficient with them, also had a reception. Amari DeMarcado had 2 rushing attempts, and DJ Dallas did nothing in week 2. He really did nothing in week 1. He just had that, kickoff return for a touchdown, which equated to fantasy points in most leagues. But, Benson is a handcuff. It's James Conner's backfield. He's the workhorse back. So, you're starting in this one. Studs across the board. Let's move along. Next up, we will have the Ravens traveling to face the Cowboys. Derrick Henry was my must-start running back of the week in week 2. And most of you guys probably listening saying like, oh, yeah, no crap. I mean, it's Derrick Henry. But I had so many questions after that Thursday night game against the Chiefs. Like, what's going to happen with Derrick Henry and Justice Hill, and Derrick Henry looks sluggish and all this stuff. And I actually expected more fantasy points against the Raiders in week 2 out of Derrick Henry, but he at least had 4.67 yards per carry, 84 yards on the ground, and a touchdown. He did add a reception, but I'm not going to bank on many receptions for Derrick Henry on the season. Then I warned you guys, like the game script and the game plan defensively for the Chiefs really benefited Justice Hill in week 1. And unless we're seeing like a lot of defensive pressure, which maybe Micah Parsons and the Cowboys can bring this week in Lamar's face, or we're seeing a negative game script for the Ravens, which, don't get me wrong, we still saw that against the Raiders in week 2, then I don't really know what Justice Hill's role is going to be, but I certainly don't think he's going to have 8 targets and 6 receptions every week, which is the only reason he was relevant in fantasy in week 1 anyways. So Derrick Henry's still a start no matter what, and the Cowboys just got absolutely gashed by Alvin Kamara, so Henry is not going anywhere near our bench going into week 3. He's an absolute must start. Now, the Cowboys will be at home again in week 3, and the way they played in week 2, I don't know if that really matters. And I told you guys after week 1, although Ezekiel Elliott scored a touchdown, this backfield's going to be super frustrating because you're going to have weeks where Elliott stumbles on in and gets double-digit fantasy points with a low ceiling. Then you're going to have the following week where he's probably bad and maybe Rico Dowdle does something. So that kind of came true in week 2. Dowdle had 9.9 fantasy points because he had 4 receptions, and Zeke had 2.67 yards per carry, and neither of them scored a touchdown. And then Deuce Vaughn had 4 touches and 1 reception. So for me, like it's just it's a committee backfield, and you're crossing your fingers that one of these guys stumbles into the end zone or has a couple, receptions. And even then, the ceiling is super low. So the Ravens defense hasn't been particularly great like we view them to start the year, but still, I'm not starting a Cowboys running back unless I am just desperate in like a 16-man league. So I'm staying away from the Cowboys running backs, and Derrick Henry a strong start again moving into week 3. We will have the Chiefs traveling to face the Falcons, and please, everybody, moment of silence for Isaiah Pacheco, one of my favorite players in all of football, in all of fantasy football, one of my most drafted players last year and this year. Fantasy gods, why? All right, ankle injury to Pacheco. He is done for 6 to 8 weeks and essentially for all of the fantasy season. He might come back in time for the fantasy playoffs. Fortunately, he's probably going to hit IR, is what I've read, so we can at least throw him on the IR. But he's going to miss some time, and even when he's technically ready to be back, are they going to roll him right out? Or, the Chiefs, presumably making a playoff push, might try to preserve his health for the actual playoffs, which does not benefit us, fantasy football. So what do we do now? We got Samaje Perine, who's got 3 targets through the first 2 games and 0 rushing attempts. Then we got my boy. I mean, you guys were here in the offseason, even before the craze started. You guys knew that I was talking about my guy, Carson Steele. But what do we do with Carson Steele, who had 9 rushing attempts and 27 rushing yards through the first 2 games of the season? I'm not starting either of them in week 3. I can tell you that much. And do I think they're worth rostering? Sure, because this is the Chiefs and Andy Reid's system and all of that stuff. But I think we're probably going to see the Chiefs throw the football more than anything. And do not be surprised if the Chiefs go out and sign a free agent running back. I, honest to God, have not checked who's out there. I don't know who that would be. I think some people are thinking it might be Kareem Hunt, who's still out there and available and had some production last year and obviously has some familiarity with this system. But I have a bad feeling that Perine and or Steele might not be that fantasy relevant. Jarrett McKinnon is still out there and available, so he's another name I've seen floated around. I don't know what's going to happen here. We still have Clyde Edwards-Helaire on the PUP list, so I'm just staying away from the Chiefs backfield until further notice. I like the potential in Carson Steele, but I just don't know if it's going to come to full fruition this season. So I'm staying away from the Chiefs backfield, and the main reason I'm staying away is because I want to see if they sign another running back or not. So sad we miss you, Isaiah Pacheco, and unfortunately, Pirine Steele are going to be sits for the immediate time. So let's move along to the Falcons. Once again, when I'm recording this, Monday Night Football has not been played. So even if Bijan plays poorly in week 2, unless he suffers an injury, we are still rolling out Bijan Robinson at home against the Chiefs in week 3. Tyler Algier probably not going to see enough volume in week 2. Maybe I'm wrong, but probably going to be a sit and a pure handcuff. You start Bijan if you own him. We all know this. And let's hope for a speedy and successful recovery for Isaiah Pacheco. Let's move along to Sunday Night Football, where we will see the Jaguars travel to face the Bills. And Travis Etienne, some people feel a little bit disappointed by Etienne. They're concerned about this Jaguars offense, all that stuff. But 11.9 points in week 1, 14.8 points in week 2. He is still hitting double digits and has found the end zone 2 weeks in a row. So Etienne has to remain in your starting lineups regardless of how you feel about this offense. There's really nobody else to start here. I mean, I know Tank Bigsby had 12 touches in week 1, but he got a little bit banged up with a shoulder injury in week 2. He did, was able to return, but then did nothing, literally nothing. No rushing attempts, no targets, nothing. So Tank Bigsby kind of gets downgraded in terms of those handcuff guys that you're finding on the waivers or holding and stuff like that. Dearness Johnson had 5 rushing attempts, but yeah, this is Travis Etienne's backfield until further notice. I do think Buffalo might have a good day defensively, but we're still starting Travis Etienne. All right, that brings us to James Cook, a running back that I was very high on going into the season, who finished with 28.5 fantasy points in week 2, 3 total touchdowns, 1 through the air, 2 on the ground, 7.09 yards per carry. James Cook, at the time of recording this, is the RB5 in fantasy football, and we are not benching him anytime soon. Period. Don't need to really discuss it. Okay. Ray Davis saw a little bit more involvement in week 2. That was due to game script, 9 touches. He's still a pure handcuff. And even then, we're still seeing a few touches to Ty Johnson, but nothing of value. We're not considering starting Ray Davis or Ty Johnson anytime soon. Etienne, James Cook are both solid starts moving into the week. Next up, we will have the Commanders traveling to face the Bengals on Monday Night Football. Brian Robinson Jr., one of my must-start players at running back going into week 2 against the Giants. I was a little bit disappointed. I was expecting him to find the end zone, but he still had 133 yards off of 17 carries and 7.8 yards per carry, and added a reception to give you 14.6 fantasy points. So I'm still okay with Brian Robinson. I think he's a great start against this Bengals defense. He's going to be a start until further notice, and a strong start in my opinion. Austin Eckler, I had as a flex last week. Maybe you could consider him like if you're hurting enough at running back and he's like an RB2 on your roster and full PPR only, he's still an okay start after having 10.2 points in week 1 and 11.5 in week 2. 3 receptions in week 2, 4 in week 1, but was a little bit more involved on the ground in week 2 with 8 carries for 38 total yards. So he's been pretty efficient on the ground throughout the whole year. He's averaging 4.8 yards per carry through the first 2 weeks. So Eckler, this game script might benefit him, and I think he's in that flex kind of RB2 category. If you don't have anything better, he should be okay. All right, let's take a look at Zach Moss, who I expected a little bit more out of against the Chiefs in week 2. I just kind of view Zach Moss as like a fringe RB2, maybe not as good as Aaron Jones at the moment, but similar to Aaron Jones, where if you own Zach Moss and you don't have anything better at RB2, you're just going to start Zach Moss until further notice as your RB2 and, hope that he scores a touchdown, right? Which hopefully that's not your game plan, but it might be for a lot of you guys with a lot of these injuries mounting up. But Zach Moss, no touchdowns in week 2, 2.8 yards per carry and 1 reception. 5.7 fantasy points after having 4.89 yards on the ground in week 1, 2 receptions, a touchdown, and 14.1 fantasy points. So here's the good news is Zach Moss will face the Commanders and the Panthers in the next 2 weeks. So he's going to be a start this week because this Commanders defense on the road is the worst defense in the NFL. So, and then the following week, they get the other worst defense in the NFL, the Carolina Panthers. So for the next 2 weeks, you can have confidence in starting Zach Moss, and I do like him quite a bit in week 3. Chase Brown, there just hasn't been enough. He's a handcuff. He's a stash. He's nothing else. He's not seen enough involvement. He had the 3 targets and 3 receptions in week 1, which was nice to see, but none in week 2 and just 4 touches for 31 yards on the ground. Was efficient, 7.7 yards per carry, but yeah, nothing in fantasy, not enough here in fantasy to start Chase Brown. So I do like the Commanders running backs a lot this week, and I do like Zach Moss a lot this week to end the week on Monday Night Football. I definitely think you have some good options in this matchup. And that'll do it for today's video. There's every single relevant running back, every single matchup, and who you should start and sit. Don't forget, as the week goes on, we will have everything that you guys need. Start sits at every position. We already have our must start defenses out, our early waiver wire video out. We will have must start kickers coming out this week, buy low trade candidates, and running backs / wide receivers that will dominate week 3, as well as a late last minute waiver wire video and an early breakdown Sunday morning with everything you need to know going into week 3. So make sure you guys are subscribed so you don't miss out on any of the content dropping throughout the week. And most importantly, drop any fantasy football questions down below. I will answer every single comment on this video before Thursday Night Football and then again before Sunday's slate gets underway. Any fantasy football questions, any format, whatever you guys need, drop them down below. I will get back to you. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.